Good afternoon, everyone. You are very much welcomed in our panel with our dear keynote speaker, Dr. Quinetta Roberson, about leading inclusive organizations and societies. I will briefly present Professor Quinetta, Professor Maria Tereza Fleury, and Juliana Carvalho, which will be also with us and Quinetta today to discuss and to reflect about her talk. Quinetta is a distinguished professor of management and psychology at the Michigan State University, but prior to her current position, she was an endowed chair at Villanova University and a tenured professor at Cornell. She also has been a visiting scholar at university pretty much everywhere except Antarctica, and served as an appointment as program director of science organizations at the National Science Foundation. She is currently the president of Academy of Management. Quinetta is very well known for her research on developing organizational capabilities, enhancing effectiveness through strategic management of people. Her research has appeared in journals like AMR, AMJ, and others. She has over 20 years of experience teaching courses and workshops on leadership, talent management, and diversity. Today we'll be with Quinetta, also Professor Maria Tereza Leme Fleury, which is a full acting leader of our academia. She is full professor of international strategy at FGV, and she has been dean of the two of the most prestigious schools of our academy in Brazil, current president of the Academy of International Business, and full professor at both a public and a private university, which are FEA and FGV. Maria Tereza also held different visiting appointments at Sussex, England, Japan. She is on the board of many universities also abroad. She also a very known, researcher, scholar, graded by CNPq, which is our National Science Foundation, Quinetta. So everybody knows Maria Tereza, and she gladly accepted our invitation to participate in your talk. And we also invited Juliana Costa Carvalho. Juliana Costa Carvalho is a young PhD candidate at the Brazilian School of Public Management and Private Management, Public and Private Management. Her research agenda focuses on leadership and specifically inclusive leaderships. And also is joining the panel Claudia Bintencourt, which is our director in the board of ENANPAD. So Quinetta, you're very much welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here and to listen to your keynote. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This is such an honor. I have to say that I have, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've been a visiting professor at different places, including FGV, which was very exciting for me. And my wonderful PhD students in my course at the time sent me back to the US with a necklace, which I decided to wear today. It's 5 years later, but I have it because I feel like it brings me good vibes from my visit and my time in Sao Paulo. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to interact with everyone. What I wanted to do was to talk a bit about what I've done in my research, how I've gotten to talk about and explore the issues of inequality and inclusion, some of the insights that I found, and also those that I've tried to put into practice in my role at the Academy of Management, but also where I think we can go. So what do we know and what don't we know, and how we can start to continue to push the field forward. So I'm going to share my screen and just talk briefly about the of leading inclusive organizations and societies. And then I look forward to having a wonderful discussion and sharing, we all being able to share our insights. As we talk about inequality and we talk about inclusion, one of the things in the US, we often hear people say DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But if we put them on a timeline, one of the things we see is that they're actually in a different order, if you will, that the research on fairness, justice, equity in particular started in 1965. And we started talking probably in the 1970s about how that applies within organizations. We then started moving more towards a focus on the differences that were in the workforce, and more people started talking about diversity. And then that evolved into a discussion of inclusion. And so I wanted to, I feel that I've been along that same trajectory and have gained some insights along the way. And so I wanted to talk starting about moving from equity, or the intersection, I would say, of equity and diversity. I will tell you that prior to being a professor, I was actually a banker. I was a financial analyst in the banking industry. And, I'm sure no one wants to hear about that right now. But one of the things that I found very interesting about my experience was that this was in the probably early to mid 90s, where people were just starting to talk about diversity. And I wondered about, I looked at the way managers treated employees. I looked at some of the things, the changes that were happening in the workforce. And even before I decided to get a PhD, I started thinking about how diversity relates to fair treatment. And so when I got to the university and studying, I started looking at these types of issues. And one of the first studies I did was to examine how people experience diversity in the workplace. And one of the things that I think we do, or we find as researchers, is that we often put our perspective onto our respondents and our subjects, and to the people who are responding to our surveys or participating in our interviews. We don't necessarily collect or attempt to understand their lived experience. And so to some degree, I wanted to get into the phenomenon of diversity and fairness, but understand it from employees' point of view. And so I did a study with my dissertation chair at the time on making sense of diversity in the workplace. And this just shows you the paper. It was in 2006 in Journal of Applied Psychology. But we looked at organizational justice and what's called language abstraction in people's accounts of diversity-related incidents. And I'll explain to you what that means. What we did was to ask people two simple questions. Name a positive or describe a positive diversity-related incident at work. Describe a negative diversity-related incident at work. And there were things that some people talked about how their managers treated them, or they talked about interacting with their peers or their colleagues. Others talked about, I remember one comment, they said, they bought us new chairs. And we thought, what does this have to do with diversity? But again, if we focus on employees or people's lived experiences, then rather than me say, well, this has nothing to do with diversity, we wanted to find what did it have to do with diversity. And in exploring the comments, a couple of things we found is that people recall different types of incidents and different types of experiences. And a lot of those had to do with fairness, whether they were represented in groups, whether or in management, whether they had a voice, how fairly they were treated, the nature of their work relationships, how respectful people were with each other. There were a number of different things. But what we did was to qualitatively analyze those comments further, and we found that they talked about aspects of organizational justice as we know it: procedural justice, distributive justice, interpersonal and informational justice. And so we started to be able to pull out how people think about or do sense making about diversity at work. The other thing we found is that there were differences in the language that they used. the way that they framed their experiences and whether they saw them as discrete events or whether they internalized them or thought of them as part of the culture of the organization. And so it was very enlightening to understand that, you know, up until this point, a lot of the things we've written about and read about in terms of diversity have focused just on the composition or representation of groups or of workforces. But this gave us a more complex perspective, that it's something beyond just who is in the workforce, but we have to really be sensitive about what that experience is if we're going to create more inclusive environments, organizations, and societies. And so I took that learning with me as I started to move through my career and focusing on diversity, but not just so much in terms of diversity as who, but diversity as what, right? That what is that lived experience, or what kind of environment helps to facilitate diversity and get the benefits of diversity, and also create more equitable and equal environments in organizations. And one of the things that I did in my first academic job was at Cornell University, and I taught a diversity course, both for undergraduates and graduate students. And I would often invite people from industry and people who were practitioners to talk about diversity. Well, there was one time when we had I was introducing someone in the class, and I said, they're here to speak to us about diversity. And they said, well, that is not true. I'm here to speak about inclusion. And I thought, oh, okay, I'd heard this word inclusion before, but I wanted to know, how did that differ from diversity? Tell me what you do. And as they talked about what the company did, I didn't think that I heard anything that was very different than what I already knew about managing diversity in organizations. And so this started me thinking again about experience, and how is the experience of diversity different from the experience of inclusion? Are they different at all? And so I did a follow-up study I did another study to examine that intersection of diversity and inclusion, because people often, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but often people will say diversity and inclusion as if it's one thing. They say it as if it's one word. And so I wonder, what are they? Do they work? Are they separate? Do they work together? Are they the same thing? And so I did a study that was published in 2006 in Group and Organization Management to separate the meanings of diversity and inclusion, but also to look at how how organizations try to create different experiences, or try to create diverse experience versus inclusive experiences. And what I found was that there was a difference between diversity and inclusion. And in particular, it was on a continuum that moved from a focus on equity and having equitable and fair environments to moving to something else where diversity and fairness was more part of how an organization operates. And so one of the things, and you'll see this here, is that at the very foundational level, organizations focused on fair treatment, of course, on having equitable systems where people had similar experiences with the practices and policies of an organization. They also talked about representation, or having diversity in the organization. But while we had heard about those things before, some other things that I heard that I hadn't heard before was the importance of leadership commitment. That in order to have equitable organizations, in order to have diverse organizations, leaders really have to be invested or have a commitment to doing this work. That if it's not supported by leaders who are leaders who are championing this work and who are supporting this work, then there's no way that other people in the organization are going to do so. Another thing we heard about was employee access and opportunity, but employees having the resources and the information they need in order to be able to engage in the work and be successful in the organization. And we see this, we've seen this in some early inclusion work, which talked about being an insider and having access to information and resources. Some of that work was more in the social networks literature. But here we heard HR, human resource professionals, and diversity professionals talking about the importance of employees having what they needed in order to do a good job and in order to be successful in the work environment. But then the final thing we heard is having all of this, the fairness and the equity and the representation and the commitment and the access and opportunity, all of this integrated into the organization's processes or activities, so that it wasn't sometimes what you see in organizations is that organizations have their business and then they have diversity. They see them as separate. They don't necessarily see them as related. But in many organizations, it takes people in order to get the work done, and getting the best out of people has to do with being able to manage and leverage diversity and create equitable and inclusive environments. So it has to become part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So this to me was very fascinating because it, again, in comparison to my earlier work, where it showed that diversity is more complex as we think about the lived experience, what this showed me is that at the organizational level, it was still even more complex, that it's not just about hiring diverse workforces, or it's not just, having differences in the workforce or different levels of an organization, but there's being able to really leverage that and get the benefits of that out of the organization in order to drive business goals, in order to drive organizational strategy. So as I mentioned, this was in 2006, which, is a very long time ago. We think about now that's 15 years ago. And what I found is that, over that last 15 years, inclusion research has evolved. That while I was focusing on the conceptualization of inclusion, there has been research where researchers have focused on antecedents to inclusion. So, how do we create environments, or what do we need to do in order for people to feel included? There's work by researchers that say that people have to have a sense of uniqueness and belonging. There's other work that shows that they have to have a feeling of being an insider in an organization. There's also research that looks at climates for inclusion. Climates for inclusion being, what are those things that drive perceptions of inclusion in organizations, or employees feeling like they belong to an inclusive organization? And what that work does is focus on practices. As we look at the research, there's also been evolution in terms of the measurement of inclusion. And so, how do we know, how can we tell the difference between organizations that are more inclusive or less inclusive? And even though there has been evolution in this way, those of you who are familiar with the research knows that we still have a long way to go, that there are so many unanswered questions within the field that we have about inclusion. And so as I am currently the immediate past president of the Academy of Management, and then the Academy of Management for our leadership team, you are elected to a 5-year term in the organization on the leadership track, where you move from professional development workshop chair for the conference and vice president-elect of the organization. Next, you move to program chair and vice president, where you're responsible for the entire conference, as well as for related responsibilities in the organization. Then you move from president-elect to president, which I was last year, and now I'm past president. And so when I had the opportunity to be program chair, so for those of you who don't know, the Academy of Management is approximately a 20,000 member organization of management and organizational scholars all across the world. And for me, that was such a, it was such an honor, but it was also very daunting to think about, I now have to plan a conference that's going to be engaging and interactive and just really developmental and enjoyable for all of these members who can attend. And one of the things that I thought about, one of the things you get to do as program chair is to come up with the theme. And I thought about it and I thought, you know, this is where I can actually have an opportunity to move the field forward. And so when the Academy of Management meeting was in Boston in 2019, I was able to introduce the topic or the program theme of in understanding the inclusive organization. Now, a lot of people think, when we think about inclusion, many people think, oh, that's just for diversity researchers. But in thinking about this work, what I found over the years is that there are so many people doing this work in so many different forms, that there are critical management theorists who are thinking about what does it mean to be inclusive, that there are strategy researchers that are thinking about what does inclusion mean at that level of analysis. There are international scholars who are thinking about the construct as it pertains to cultural values, as we think about geographic differences, as we think about it across different cultural contexts. Those are just a few examples, but what I found was that, and actually just to offer one other perspective, people talk about inclusion even outside of our field, that I found that mathematicians talk about inclusion and engineers talk about inclusion. So I really wanted to take all of our collective talents and all of our collective knowledge and insight to be able to understand inclusion. And so if you go to the Academy website, you can see the program and some of the outputs from that conference, but there was so much learning about, what it means to be inclusive. And so, while you can read what some other researchers, have done in the area, one of the things that I learned through that conference is that while we talk about being inclusive, I often have organizational leaders say, what does that mean? What do I need to do? Tell me what the behaviors or the actions are in creating an inclusive organization. And that got me thinking, and that is where my research is right now on understanding what is inclusive leadership. Because as I mentioned before, my early work shows that leader commitment is really important. But one of the things I think we've seen since then is that it's not just about leader commitment, it's about a demonstrated commitment. It's about leader involvement and leader action. And so that's where, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about and I'm studying now. Interestingly, if you look in our literature on inclusive leadership, there are two separate bodies of work. There are the people who study inclusion, and then there are people who study leadership. And they both talk about inclusive leadership, but interestingly, they don't necessarily talk to each other. And so while inclusion tells us there's some things about uniqueness and belonging and having people treated as insiders, the leadership literature tells us about inviting input from others and leaders being accessible and available and open to debate and criticism. It also tells us, even though we have two different perspectives, what are some of the outcomes of inclusion? Because a lot of that we don't know. And we have some research to suggest that inclusive leadership can lead to better quality relationships, can make employees feel that they are valued, that they therefore are more committed and engaged in an organization. And there are various outcomes. But I wanted to, and one of the things I continuously try to do now is to understand what is the intersection of those two things, inclusive leadership. And really, as I think about my experience at the Academy of Management or in other roles that I have at the university, et cetera, and me trying to be a leader, but to lead inclusively, that has become part of my current work, is to understand what does that mean. And so I just wanted to share some current or preliminary findings with you on what I found so far. One of my colleagues who's at Syracuse University, we recently published a paper in Group and Organization Management, which will be part of a special issue on inclusive leadership. And I'm really excited I've seen the other papers, and I think it's just really going to provide some useful insights. What we did was to do a qualitative study to ask leaders, what do you do in order to be inclusive, right? To ask them, rather than me say, based on my researcher expertise and my academic, knowledge and experience, this is what it is. I just wanted to find what leaders actually do to make people feel included. And this is just one figure that I pulled out of the paper. But a couple of things that are pretty interesting to me, and there were 4 themes that emerged. One was that they talked about being able to value differences, right? And so, of course, being able to recognize that there are differences in organizations, but also to value that everyone has something unique to bring to the organization. And they talked about not necessarily just looking at someone's identity, right, in terms of who they are, but more so what can be their contribution? What are those things that they bring to the organization and bring to work that really help to make us better? And so focusing not only just on individual characteristics, but on individual contributions was very important. The second thing they noted was to build organizational systems or infrastructures that are equitable and that give everyone the same opportunity to succeed in the organization. And so, when we think about diversity management and we think about building inclusive organizations and societies, some people will talk about staffing. Some people will talk about performance management. Some people will talk about engagement. Some people will talk about, thinking about leadership strategies, but they're all related. Right. And so we have to think about how to do it from a systemic point of view, not just individual practices, but more so, how can we put systems in place with practices that reinforce each other and create these experiences where people feel that they have a sense of belonging and they can make a contribution. The third thing they talked about is empowering employees or empowering people in the organization, asking them for their input, giving them voice, and not just voice to speak up and offer their opinion or perspective, but giving them the opportunity to debate, giving them the opportunity to criticize, to constructively criticize, right? And so those kinds of things are, we know from the conflict research that there is a good, there's some benefits to conflict if people can do it constructively. So really stimulating that discussion and debate so that there's better problem solving and better decision-making in the organization. The final thing they talked about is creating psychologically safe environments where employees don't have to wait to be invited in to participate, but more so that they feel that there is an open environment where there's a two-way communication or there's open communication with their peers, and they can engage in a way that is authentic, in a way where everyone feels that they're contributing to the same goals and the same team. Now, for me, this was great because I got to see I got to hear from leaders what they do. But then my question was, do employees experience this, right? So I know that there's some leaders where I say, on a scale from 1 to 10, how inclusive are you? And they say, oh, I'm a 9. But if I ask their employees will say they're a 6, right? And what's the reason for the variance? What's the reason for the discrepancy? And it's sometimes because leaders are talking about their espoused values or the value that they put on inclusion or what they want to try to achieve. But there's a difference in terms of what they actually do. And so one of the things that I'm working on now is to get employees' experiences to understand what do leaders do to make them feel included. Another thing that I'm working on, I have my colleague again at Syracuse, as well as one of my PhD students here at Michigan State University, is we have interviews from 51 CEOs and top CEOs and other executives of hospitality companies. And we interviewed them not to find out what they do, but what's the challenges? We wanted to talk about, why can't they be inclusive? Or, if they want to be inclusive, what are the things that prevent them or that represent challenges? Or what are some of the things that actually could help facilitate being an inclusive leader? And I will tell you, this is not published. We are currently analyzing the data. And to my fellow qualitative researchers, as we analyze and go through, our grounded theory methodology with these interviews, it is not an easy process. But one of the things that we're finding is that there's, of course, a difference between, as I mentioned from the prior study, a difference between thought and action. And there's a lot of things in the middle that influence whether the way someone thinks about inclusive leadership actually leads to inclusive leadership. So some things we're seeing is that the culture of the organization matters. That is it an entrepreneurial culture? Is it a family culture? How do they do things or go about the work in the organization? Influences how they think about inclusion and how they demonstrate inclusion. Leadership style is also one thing that is important. There are some leaders who say, I am open and I am democratic and I want to get everyone's perspective and involve everyone. And then there's some leaders who say, I am the leader. It is up to me to make the final decision. And so given how they see power distance, how they see power in the organization, influences how they are going to actually think about and demonstrate inclusive leadership. Another factor is what we call the instrumentality of leadership. But they think about my financial brain. We used to always say someone bottom line me, right? Give me the end result or tell me about the end result. And so one of the things that some leaders want to know is, how is this going to benefit them? How is this going to benefit the team, their department, their business area, the organization? But they want to know what's the outcome. If they are inclusive, is it going to have a benefit or is it going to, help them in some way? And whether they see that as being useful or not will determine how they think about inclusion and whether they're inclusive or not. There's also some ambiguity that people, I will tell you, and this is not just in my research, but in my practice of working with organizations, people are scared or have a fear of getting things wrong, or getting something incorrect, or they have a low tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. So whether, depending on that level of comfort, some leaders are comfortable with ambiguity and they say, you know what, I'm just going to try. Others want to know if I do something, what the outcome is going to be. They want a little bit more certainty. Of course, that's going to affect the way they approach inclusive leadership. but then also how vulnerable they're willing to be. Those that are, have a lower tolerance for risk are less likely to be vulnerable. And so they don't want to make a misstep, and they won't necessarily engage in an authentic way with others because inclusion creates, all of those things create more ambiguity, and it creates more vulnerability. And so it prevents them from really going as deep as they may need to in certain situations. But for those leaders who have a higher tolerance for ambiguity, or who are more willing to be vulnerable, you find that there's this greater need for or desire to build trust with others. And then they'll work to kind of build foundations of trust in order to create these inclusive environments. So these are just some preliminary results. Like I said, we may find that these themes change, or maybe they expand in some way. But one of the things that it reveals to me is how much we still don't know about building inclusive organizations or building inclusive societies, and how much more we have to go. So as we look at this timeline, and I said we started from equity, and we learned about fairness, and we learned about diversity, and we learned about inclusion. But what I like to suggest is that we push those boundaries, that really, as we continue along this timeline, we really need to think about what's next. What are those questions to better understand how to create that sense of belonging, or how to create the experiences of inclusion? What are the experiences of inclusion? What are the leadership behaviors that will help to drive those experiences? How do we build infrastructures and strategies in order to develop that? How do we critique ourselves so that we have a more continuous improvement, or we try to continuously push the boundaries for inclusion? These are the things that I think are critical, so that while we know some things are ready, I don't think that we can stop there. As we know, this work is a journey, and so we need to continue along in that journey to truly be able to understand how do we create inclusive organizations and societies. With that, I will stop sharing, and I will invite comment and discussion, because I would love to continue this these insights and having this dialogue with others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quinetta. It is a journey indeed. So it's a great way to finish. I just have to say that your screen wasn't shared, the presentation wasn't shared.
Oh,
but
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry that I'm saying it now, because I thought that you were talking, and talk was so, great that I didn't want to interrupt, but we can take care of that. We can send by email the presentation later on.
Okay.
So I will thank you again, and then ask for Maria Tereza and Juliana to jump in with the first reflections. Thank you, Maria Tereza.
Thank you, Quinetta, for this invitation. And thank you, Quinetta, for your very timely and insightful presentation. Even if we didn't have the slides, I prefer you speaking like you did. So I enjoyed your definition that inclusive societies are open systems of opportunities in which all members have access to information, resources, and capacity to contribute. And I thought, when I was thinking to prepare something to say, I thought this definition changed throughout the years. And I think that your message gave a very good timeline of all these changes. And I just want to say a few words about myself and my experience with this theme. I am a sociologist by training, and I studied at University of São Paulo during the 70s. It was a very challenging period in Brazil with the military government. And for us on that time, an inclusive society meant social and economic inclusion and political freedom, of course. Later on, having the opportunity to study in the US at Stanford, gender and minorities issues became relevant, and I had the opportunity to participate in several initiatives on that time. Then coming back to Brazil, I started working in business schools, FGV, first at FGV, then I moved back to University of São Paulo, and then back to FGV again. And with the traditional career combining teaching, research, and administrative positions. And I became, vice dean and dean of FAIR, the School of Business, Economics, and Accountancy at University of São Paulo. So you can, you know what I'm saying about it's not a business school, it's a business and economic and accountancy school. And it was we faced challenging decisions on that time. Because University of São Paulo faced the question, are we going to adopt racial quotas, in the admission process, or any other form of inclusion? And we decided to have, a more social and economic approach. So I'm not going to explain everything, but we gave higher grades for those students that came from public schools and not private schools. And I was one of I really fought for this decision, because in my opinion, it was a much more inclusive way to bring in new people to the university. And at the end of the day, we were right. And it changed, the students' profile at University of São Paulo. Then I stepped down from University of São Paulo because I was invited to become dean at FGV, a School of Business. And FGV, as Alqueta knows very well, because she works at FGV Rio, and I work at FGV São Paulo. It's a private institution, and we face similar but some very different problems, because we have to look at, students coming from different regions of the country, different backgrounds, educational backgrounds, different family backgrounds, and provide a different support in order to have a much more inclusive institution. And now I think that we have a broader definition of inclusion. And recently, as a member of the Academy of International Business, and I have a similar career as you had. Actually, I was program chair in 2019 in Copenhagen. So, but, for the next year conference, and now I am the president-elect, and I have been working with Andrew Gilius. He's the program chair for AIB 2022 conference in Miami. And the theme is Beyond Diversity and Inclusion, Equity and Fairness in International Business. So I think that we are more or less in the same page. And we propose to tackle this theme in different dimensions. At the academia, for example, in leadership positions, research methodologies, not, trying different methodologies. At the firm level, which is very important for us, at the multinational firm and at the startups. And now I have one of my supervisee he wants to look at gender leadership in startups and how all the private, I thought it's so good to have, I'm going to say a boy. He's not a boy, of course. He's an adult. But, coming from a startup and wanting to look at this thing, it's good. And not to have only women and, and we are going to look at new questions and new problems. But we look at the country level. And I'm very much concerned and I very much focus on countries and regions. And that's why I have a question for you. I know that you are for a different perspective, but as I am a sociologist and I have been working with organizational studies and strategy, I think that's quite important to deal with those concepts of cultural, economic, and political context. Looking, for example, not only in the developed world, but emerging market and developing world. North America and Europe, now they are much more focused in Asia than in Africa or Latin America. So I think that we have to add this other dimension to the theme of diversity and inclusion. So at first, when I thought about your definition, I was asking you if there was a historical perspective, but your whole presentation was about this. But coming from another organization and coming from a different perspective, I think that context matters. That's why I want to make my contribution. So thank you again for your wonderful speech, and thank you, Alqueta, for this invitation, Claudia.
Thank you, Maria Tereza. And Quinetta, I would like to add to the question another cue that we had from audience, so which I think relate to Maria Tereza's, which is if you have a society that is not inclusive, wouldn't be very complicated. So what are the challenges to create companies that are inclusive? I think it's on the same vibe, yeah. Yes,
I appreciate the, thank you for that, Maria Tereza. I think the understanding it at the country level is extremely important, in particular because of the way the contextual factors that you mentioned, like economics and politics. In addition to, a lot of times we just think of the cultural values, but there are all of these other contextual factors. And in my experience in even talking about inclusion across different cultures, that there, in some cultures, inclusion is primarily a term for people with disabilities, not necessarily the broader, workforce. In other cultures, it's meaning something else and thinking about it from a socioeconomic standpoint. One of the other things that I think that it's important for context to understand is also, what does inclusion mean among various stakeholders? So I'm doing work now with banks and credit unions and thinking about financial inclusion and thinking, when we think, and this goes to one of the questions that was raised by Teo, my Portuguese is awful, so forgive my pronunciation. But thinking about, the question was raised, do we have to just look at leaders in organizations? Could we look at, poor women organizing themselves to survive? And I think one is, thinking about inclusive leadership. Leadership doesn't mean a formal capacity, right? It means the act of leadership. And if we think about inclusion, there are different forms of inclusion. And so while the literature focuses on employees and those experiences, we can also think from a marketing perspective customer experience of inclusion. What are inclusive customer experiences? We can think about it in terms of financial inclusion and people having access to financial resources to be able to make decisions, to do personal decision making, to have a livelihood. So I think that if we kind of broaden the nomological net, and Maria Tereza, you brought in your sociological perspective, and we can bring in the anthropological perspective, and we can bring in the financial perspective. That's where I think this interdisciplinary vantage point and combining our perspectives are really going to help us start to understand the phenomenon and being able to understand, you know, what does inclusion really mean? And so I certainly think that studying poor women organizing themselves, thinking about different forms of organization, thinking about the outcomes other than financial outcomes, right? Thinking about health outcomes and well-being outcomes and societal outcomes. All of those things are going to be important. And so I do think that it's for us as a society to kind of break those boundaries that we don't, this lens that we have is, or we tend to have as researchers, to be able to expand that and do some boundary spanning to really understand the phenomenon and how to build these types of organizations and societies we want. Now, to be inclusive, I also want Juliana to chime in here.
Yeah,
so
that's what I was asking right now. Juliana, your turn.
So, hi, Quinetta, how are you? So I was reading your paper on inclusive leadership. And one thing I was wondering that it gives a more broad perspective on that. But I was thinking, how would that work for specific minority groups? Because when we think about diversity, especially in business, nowadays we are thinking about minorities. It's really hard to not think about it. And especially in Brazil, since last year, we're thinking the inclusion of Black individuals. We are having specific leadership programs for Black individuals, which are poorly represented in organizations. So we had very interesting initiatives about that. And I know the same is happening in the US. We also have initiatives for people with different disabilities and women. But when I was reading about inclusive leadership, I was reading about that dimension that talks about valuing differences, but I was not able to understand how one can work on each type of difference. And I was thinking that maybe coming from the employee perspective, that would be better understood. But I was wondering, what do you think inclusive leaders should do for these different groups?
Thank you for that. I think it's a very complex question because I think that inclusive leaders will understand. So people will say I'll use an example. I was on a call earlier today where an organization told me they had one female leader. The most they've ever had was 4, and that the 3 of them have left in the last 2 years, right? So they said, what we want to do is go get more female leaders. And I was like, why do you want to get more? First question. And when those leaders are in the organization, what do you want them to do? What do you expect them to do? Because if we value them just for saying, well, look, now we've gone from 1 to 2 or 2 to 4, it doesn't necessarily, again, that's valuing them as a number or for their demographic membership rather than for the contribution that they're going to make. The other thing is that we know, and Juliana, you referenced, Black and brown people in organizations. One of the things we're finding now too is that in an effort to be inclusive, leaders are saying, I'm going to put you in charge of this new diversity initiative. I'm going to give you responsibility for doing this. But we know 2 things. 1, that's not the valued work in the organization. And 2, you're giving them more work. You're giving them extra role responsibilities. So now you want them to do more of work that's not valued, but be successful. And so it creates this kind of double bind or this challenge. So I think your question is really important, because for minorities, being inclusive, that what I talked about in terms of this model of inclusion is a general model. But if we talk about how to put that into practice for different groups, it's going to mean not overburdening minorities in the organization, or it's going to mean not giving women the support work. At the end of a meeting, say, why don't you send out the notes? No, why do I have to send out the notes, right? So that kind of, and so we have to be, one of the things we talk briefly about in the paper is I don't know what the only word I can think about. So we talk about it as person role fit, or also we talk about person contribution fit, because we will often say to someone, oh, you know what? This person is really good in this way. This is their contribution. But if we see them for a specific membership or a specific identity, we only take that as their narrow contribution. We don't necessarily explore all of the ways that they can contribute. We also don't explore how, if they are on a team with others, the synergies that can be created in terms of new competencies and new capabilities. And so one of the other things I think we have to do as being inclusive is not just say, Juliana, come on, I want you to give your perspective, but I've got to say, tell me how you want to contribute, right? I want to know, what do you see as your contributions? Because I may not know them. And so leaders, just because I'm a leader doesn't mean that all knowledge flows from me. And so I have to be able to understand what I think is your contribution, the ways that you see your contribution, and finding a fit so that there is so that the contribution actually happens. So I think that's really important. And I think, I was noticing in the chat that people commented on the research questions that have come to mind as we're having this discussion. And I think that's a big opportunity that you described, that thinking about how what we already know about inclusion translates to other groups. I have a project with 2 PhD students here where we're looking at immigrant experiences of belonging, because a lot of the work on belonging suggests that someone wants to fit in, which is an assumption, right? That somebody wants to fit in, where that's not necessarily all of the everyone's experience. But the other thing is that them fitting in, that there's a challenge, there's a difference between kind of assimilating but staying unique. But as we talk about immigrant experiences, there's not a lot that shows that people want to take some of those contributions from immigrants in order to change the organization or change the society. They're just saying, hey, we'll let you sit with us, right? But that's not what this is about. If we're really focusing on inclusion, we're thinking about how to get better using everyone's talents and everyone's knowledge and everyone's contributions.
That's great, and reminds me about academic journals just fulfilling the quota of minority. So you see the same people all over the same journal. So it's a very artificial way of, embracing the agenda. We know that you were late, Quinetta, but I think a good way of terminating your presentation would be talking a little bit about the resistance to the inclusive agenda. So we know that, this is a topic that kind of influences, etc., power relations within and outside organizations. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about resistance. So what are the groups that don't embrace the agenda? So how do you see our challenges ahead in terms of that in any organization?
Oh gosh, we should have started with this from the beginning. It's so complex. I think that there is definitely resistance. And I think it comes from a number of places. I think one is people not understanding what we're talking about when we mean inclusive. To some degree, people think that we mean diversity. Some people think, I know in the US, they think that that could mean affirmative action. It means, I think in people have to do their own sense making. Does this mean I have to give up power? Does this mean that, you know, there's going to be, I'm not going to have fair treatment in an organization? I think there's a number of things. But one of the things, and I will completely say this based on my experience and based on my strengths, my area of strengths. Like I said, I was a banker and we focus on the bottom line. And I know that in a lot of organizations that the leaders want to know, again, what's that outcome? How is this going to improve our organization? So one of the things, and I'm now giving away my secrets, I'm now giving away my strategies, but I will actually start with the end story. I will say, this is how you can, increase your effectiveness in this way. This is how you can improve your functioning in this way. This is how you can increase profitability in this way. This is how you can. And usually they, as a diversity person or talking about HR, they don't expect me to talk the language of business. But me talking about outcomes and talking about effectiveness, they're like, okay, continue. And then I start talking about the role of people, which we all know there's a lot of knowledge work that's done now and people who are responsible for getting work done. So I say, this is why it's important to kind of engage and motivate, et cetera. And then they're like, okay, continue. And then the last thing we get to is the inclusion stuff. And so what I'm doing rather than say inclusion is important for these reasons, I say, let's focus on how you determine your effectiveness at the end of a year, at the end of a quarter, at the end of a time period, and then talk about how to get there, how to drive to your goals, how to drive to your outcomes. Most of the time, what I get is the resistance goes down because people say, I've never heard it put in this way. They will say that they thought that inclusion, as I mentioned in the beginning, is something separate. I'm now going to do what's important, and now I'm going to do inclusion. But by showing the relationship between the two, it starts to decrease the resistance because they're now saying, that they can see the why, that they're motivated. But then the other thing, and we know this from all of our research on motivation and self-efficacy, they have to have models that they can do it, right? And so I will let leaders and I'll let people know that this is, it may be challenging, but you can do it, right? It's not only the geniuses in the world who are inclusive. It's not the most successful people in the world who are inclusive. A lot of times when we look at models of inclusion, it's the people who have this continuous learning and are continuously thinking about how to improve and how to do better and how to be more inclusive. That's what we need to kind of generate that mindset. And so letting people know that it's possible to be successful and to just stay along the journey really is what helps to address the resistance.
Thank you very much. I know that you are very busy, so I'm not going to keep you any longer here today, but it was a real pleasure to have you with us and to share this important talk that is everything to do with our major theme of our event. I would also like to thank Juliana and Maria Tereza, and Claudia wants to have a brief talk to invite people for the next panel. But Quinetta, once again, thank you, and you are free to continue your busy agenda. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and an honor. I appreciate Maria Tereza and Juliana's engagement. I now have questions and research ideas in my brain, but then to everyone who's attended, thank you for your engagement. I'm still on the journey, and so I appreciate and enjoy the fact that we're on this journey together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cláudia, quer convidar para a palestra?
Sim, está acontecendo agora o painel internacional da área de TE, Inovação, Tecnologia e Empreendedorismo, sobre pesquisa baseada em intervenção. Então, aqueles que têm interesse podem entrar ali na nossa programação e acessar o link. A palestra, então, continua. Aproveitando que terminamos um pouquinho mais cedo, né? E eu queria aproveitar e agradecer a Juliana e a Maria Tereza também pelas questões e pelas reflexões trazidas no debate.
Obrigada.
Muito obrigada, muito obrigada. Até a próxima.
Obrigada, Alqueta, pelo convite. Foi um prazer estar com vocês aqui hoje. E também gostei demais da apresentação da Quinetta, comentários da Juliana. Acho as suas também intervenções, Alqueta, super oportunas. A gente aprende sempre. Muito legal.
Isso é importante, nós continuamos a aprender. Tchau, tchau. Obrigada, obrigada. Tchau.
Tchau, gente. Obrigada.
Tchau.
Obrigada, Juliana.